Okay, well, today you get me as your visiting professor when it comes to talking about different chapters in Johnson, right? Yeah, there's a lot fewer applause now than there used to be. I'm not sure why that is. I gave a lot of thought to how you get at Johnson's idea of the slow hunch in a way that introduces a group of students to the kind of research that's being done by faculty on campus, right? When we took a look at chapter 1, we had Susie Pryor talking a lot about the adjacent possible and the ways in which for in entrepreneurship, she saw that idea playing out in what she does, right? And she was able to do that through anecdotes, right? Single sorts of partnerships that she was involved in. And then when we had Jessica Luck talking to us, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, about liquid networks, she was able to talk to us about the way in which that concept surfaced in her research. The slow hunch is about something that happens over a long period of time. And so that provides a challenge, right? It's all about patience. It's all about sitting back and allowing things to just kind of germinate gradually. And so what I thought I'd do is tell you a story today. This story may either be, on my part, the most self-indulgent thing I've ever done, hopefully not the most boring thing you've ever sat through, or it will be something that illustrates the way that the slow hunch is operated as I've approached my research, okay? Because these visiting professor things that we've had going on, they serve two functions. One is to try to show how a concept from a book plays out in research. The other is to introduce you to the kind of research being done on this campus by the faculty that are on this campus, right? So I'm going to introduce you to my research in a story that is all about slow hunches, all right? And what you're going to find is that I've got multiple hunches going simultaneously. One is a whole lot slower than the other. You with me? Does this sound okay?
Yeah.
Does anybody want to run screaming from the room now, or do you think you can bear this? Samuel is ready to jump up. You're like the last person I would ever imagine having that response. Kira, I can see doing that. Yeah, but less Samuel. Okay. So, I want to think first about a verb, right? I'm an English professor. I deal with historical linguistics. I deal with all that kind of stuff, with etymologies. To ruminate, right? To ruminate here, to revolve, turn over repeatedly in the mind, to meditate deeply upon. That is in some ways what I think a slow hunch is all about, right? I think a slow hunch is about having something that's in your brain that just keeps hanging out there, that you keep turning over again, until finally you arrive at some more fully formed idea than you began with, all right? So that's sort of my frame of reference for this. Now, let me begin our story. Chapter 1, Discovery and Fascination.
Aww.
This is the moment where I pander shamelessly to you and tell you, once I was a young boy. That's me at Christmas one year in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And when I was a kid, my parents took me to see Disney's Robin Hood. Anybody a fan of Disney's Robin Hood? All right, a few people. Who's not seen Disney's Robin Hood? I feel like I need to schedule a screening of Disney's Robin Hood. Okay. Some enthusiasm for that. But when I was a kid and saw Disney's Robin Hood, I became absolutely obsessed with anything that had to do with the Middle Ages. Robin Hood, King Arthur, knights, dragons, you name it. I was consumed by it, right? It absolutely fascinated me, especially knights and dragons. They were a particular favorite of mine. There's something about the contest between these heroic guys in armor and these absolutely terrifying beasts that just kind of thrilled me. And fascination. I think fascination is another key part of the slow hunch, right? To attract and hold spellbound by delightful qualities to charm or intimidate. Okay? Now, you make the connection for me. What connection do you imagine? This is my favorite game. It's called Guess What I'm Thinking. All right?
Oh.
What does fascination have to do with a slow hunch? What do you think? Samuel?
If you weren't maybe so intrigued by the idea or concept, then you wouldn't be really going through a slow hunch about it.
Yeah, if you're not intrigued by it, if it hasn't pulled you in, there's no drive there that keeps you ruminating over it, right? It's the fascination that keeps you engaged with it long enough to have a slow hunch that develops over time, right? So I've always been fascinated by this stuff. Chapter 1 was short. We move on to chapter 2, inquiry and exploration. Okay, so when I finally got to graduate school, I started exploring medieval topics more closely. And I started looking at the way that England, post the rising of 1381, imagined itself as a unified community. Now, the rising of 1381 is an amazing thing. I'm totally going to geek out over this with you right now. Hopefully you'll go with me on this. The faces I'm seeing are like, no, I'm not going. You can go there by yourself, buddy. But get this. According to chroniclers, somewhere between 60 and 100,000 peasants rose up simultaneously and converged on London, right? They burned down a palace, they killed the Archbishop of Canterbury, they killed the royal treasurer, they demanded a meeting of the king, and they did all of this in the name of the king. They said they were protecting the king from corruption, right? It's amazing. There's this huge rift in English society at the time, on class bases. And yet literary writers at the time were still imagining England as this unified space. And I sort of was fascinated by the way that they could sort of pull that off. Right? How do you imagine a place that has just gone through a massive socio-political trauma? How do you imagine it as unified? Right? How do you imagine it as a community? And so that's what I began exploring. The problem I had was I was still obsessed with Disney's Robin Hood kind of stuff. Right? And so I started exploring all of this pop culture stuff with this one question in mind. How are the Middle Ages used in popular culture? General, right? And so I started doing research on this, looking at medieval movies, video games, all this stuff. And I started presenting what I was finding at conferences and rounding up friends of mine saying, hey, you like Scandinavian death metal. You should write a paper for me about the Middle Ages and Scandinavian death metal. And believe it or not, in this book is a chapter about the Middle Ages and Scandinavian death metal.
Nice.
Right? Awesome. And so I put together this book that was exploring what the Middle Ages mean to us today. Right? And it comes out of this childhood fascination with the Middle Ages. And I'm still obsessed with the Middle Ages and popular culture. And I'm curious as to why we keep going back to that period, right? Who's ever played a medieval or a video game that is remotely set in the Middle Ages? Skyrim is a big one, right? I just freaking love Skyrim. Who's seen a medieval movie? Robin Hood, a King Arthur movie, a fairy tale movie.
Monty
Right?
Python.
Grail, right? We keep coming back to the Middle Ages, and I don't get why, right? And so I keep exploring this. Now, while I was in graduate school, a new translation of Beowulf came out in 2000. Who's read Beowulf? Go ahead. Wow! Oh my gosh! Next year, colloquium is all about Beowulf. That's what I've decided. Because not enough people in here have read Beowulf.
That's a lot of chainmail.
It is a lot of chainmail. So Beowulf is this Anglo-Saxon poem. It dates to anywhere between 800 and 1000 AD. It's written in Old English, which looks more like German than it does modern English. And this translation of Beowulf won all kinds of prizes for contemporary poetry. Right? Because it was a translation by Seamus Heaney, very well-known poet. And Beowulf tells this story of a dude that comes and helps out this community that is being ravaged by a monster named Grendel, right? And Grendel will storm into their mead hall, eat 30 men, and then go running off. And then he'll come back some other time and do it again. And so Beowulf is the guy that comes and saves everybody from Grendel. He defeats Grendel's mother, who looks for revenge, and then 50 years later, when he's an old man, he becomes king and have to save his own kingdom from a dragon that's burning everything up with its breath. Awesome story. And I became really interested in why this medieval poem would suddenly be winning all these contemporary poetry awards, right? All these book awards. And so I had this slow hunch, right? Tied in with my interest in pop culture and the Middle Ages and pop culture, movies, video games, that kind of stuff. That our culture keeps using the Middle Ages to cope with our own cultural anxieties. And I got this from the fact that Seamus Heaney, some of the critics noted that he used some Celtic words in his translation. And what they observed was that just like some of his other poetry, he was using Beowulf to think about the Irish Troubles. Do you know what the Irish Troubles are? Right? It was a period of violence between Northern Ireland and England. In specific, Catholics in Northern Ireland and Protestants that were in Northern Ireland and the Protestant-dominated country of England. Right? And so he was using this medieval poem to think about problems in the current moment. And so it got me thinking, well, maybe this is what the pop culture stuff is doing. And I got very focused on Beowulf as I thought about this. And in the same year that Seamus Heaney's Beowulf came out, 2 Beowulf movies came out. Lo and behold, one of them is really kind of cool and fun with Antonio Banderas. Which, I don't know why, I just have to say his name like that. And I'll confess to having like a little man crush on him in Desperado.
Yes.
Who's seen Desperado? Wow, that's not nearly enough people. He has this great moment where he looks right into the camera and says, "Let's play." Yeah, it's a cool moment. Anyway, very different movie. But it's a retelling of Beowulf based on a novel by Michael Crichton. A very less good, that was a really poorly constructed phrase, very less good. I teach English. A less good movie that retells Beowulf is this one with Christopher Lambert. Who's seen Highlander? There can be only one. Okay, well, stars Christopher Lambert. Oh, somebody just gave up. 2 people again. Why are people leaving? Opium's not over. This is going to be an issue. I'm going to start circulating the attendance sheet at the end.
Oh. Sorry to interrupt, but I have to go. Sorry.
Okay. Huh. Being up here, I'm experiencing colloquium the way our guests have experienced it. It's a very different experience. Yeah. Anyway, this is not a good movie. This movie is terrible. But I became, again, interested in the way that the movies were playing with these ideas. And I discovered that over the years, all kinds of movies were being made about Beowulf, including one starring Gerard Butler. Right? We like him from This Is Sparta, Kick. Right? This is the most recent retelling. It's a series on Esquire, cable channel Esquire, that's based on Beowulf. Heroes and Demons is actually an episode of Star Trek Voyager, where this whole Beowulf story happens on the holodeck. And believe it or not, the movie Aliens is a retelling of Beowulf.
What?
Yes, it is. Not I guess, totally. If you don't believe me, watch it, and then come and have a conversation with me. All right?
It's a challenge.
No, it's not a challenge. There's no challenge. It's going to be obvious by the time. Okay. And so the question that I keep ruminating over now is, how is the story of Beowulf being used to address contemporary concerns about communities? right? Because that's what Seamus Heaney was really intrigued by. The way the Irish community and the English community were in conflict with each other. And so are the movies doing the same thing for us on a much broader cultural basis? Here's the thing though, this was crazy. As I was looking for more Beowulf movies, I found a whole mess of Beowulf comic books too. Loads of them. Two of them for kids. The rest are really geared towards adults. This is the first one. No, that's up here is the first one, 1974, 1975. And then this is 1980. And the rest are all much more recent. The newest one is this one, the big red one up here. And that's actually this big, thick, massive hardcover graphic novel. It's really remarkable. Anybody into comics? A few people. It's like the same people that are into the same nerdy stuff as me. All right. And then I also found a whole bunch of children's books, all about community, or all about Beowulf, all retellings of Beowulf. And I can't find the one now that is often taught in high schools.
That one.
Rosemary Sutcliffe. Which one?
I read the Robert Nye one.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah.
That's totally not the story of Beowulf, too.
Really?
Yeah, he doesn't beat the dragon with a jar of bees.
I was so confused.
Believe it or not. Yeah. Okay. And that doesn't say anything about the board games, the sci-fi fantasy novels, and the three rock operas of Beowulf. Right? This one is very heavy metal. Probably like that one. This is less so. That was the first Beowulf rock opera. There's even a Beowulf non-rock, like opera, that is more Grendel than is Beowulf. Okay. And so, as I'm gathering all this stuff, and I own all this stuff, right? I've just been hoarding it. A new question began to emerge for me. Why are there so many retellings of Beowulf, and what are we trying to think about through that story? Now, here's the thing I'm trying to illustrate by taking you through this little journey. That a slow hunch can really be a series of questions, right? And the questions get refined over time. At least that's the way it's working for me. The question begins very broad. Well, why are we dealing with the Middle Ages now? Why do we keep using them in popular culture? To something much more specific like this. It's a refining of my own thinking over time. And I would argue that that's what the slow hunch is. That the slow hunch is recognizing some larger problem, some larger issue, right? And gradually over time, refining your thinking until you arrive at a place where you're actually able to form a cogent, specific argument about what all that stuff means. Now, the way you do that is through questions. And questions are the way slow hunches develop. That's my argument. And I think it's an argument that Stephen Johnson in the book doesn't really take up at all. Right? For him, it's just gradually over time, big ideas emerge. It's not a big eureka moment. So what I'm interested in today is how questions really drive the way we have these slow hunches. Right? Now, one of the things that I've said in recruiting students to the honors program is that we want students who are curious. And in part, it's because I want students who are going to develop these sorts of interests and have these slow hunches. Okay? So, that's the first part. We've just looked at this one. For 18 years, I have been mulling over this problem, right? Refining my thinking, gathering more and more data, right? More and more sci-fi novels that are retellings of Beowulf. More and more Beowulf games. I didn't even put the Beowulf video game up there. But there is a Beowulf video game. It was a movie tie-in. So, here's the other point I would want to make. What I'm noticing over time are these big patterns, right? There's this big pattern that Beowulf seems to crop up over and over and over again culturally. And I've dived into it much more specifically. Right? I'm not just collecting this stuff and saying, oh, here's my research. I have a collection for you. No, it's not that. I have some ideas about what's going on here. And I'll give you those in a little bit. But Suffice it to say, I think that Beowulf is a way that we're exploring community and the tensions inherent in community. Because the poem Beowulf is really interested in what tears communities apart. It's interested in outsiders and how outsiders can threaten the community. And yet at the same time, it's interested in the way that internal tension also threatens the community. Right? So I think that's what's going on here. And interestingly, if you look at when Beowulf products come out, it tends to be moments when we're having these dramatic crises with the other. Right? So after 9/11, suddenly there were a lot more Beowulf products coming out. Interesting, right? Who was the awful monster that came and ransacked our meat hall? It was Al-Qaeda on airplanes slamming into the World Trade Center. Right? So we're able to explore our anxieties about that kind of an event by turning to this medieval text and retelling it over and over again. Okay, you ready for chapter 3? This is a less slow hunch. This has not been 18 years in the making. So here's where I begin. In graduate school, with this idea that we need to find strategies to, I left a word out. I swear I do teach English. We need to find strategies to help students transition from one educational segment to another. Okay? And this is something that really became very important to me when I got to Cal State San Bernardino, when one of the deans asked me to go and be a part of a project out in Coachella Valley that was trying to link up the Palm Desert campus to College of the Desert and the local high schools out there, right? And it was a recognition that students were struggling with transitions from one part of the educational system to the next. And so the slow hunch was that if we just got people from those campuses together, from the high schools, College of the Desert, and CSUSB's Palm Desert campus, we could begin to find strategies to help students navigate those divides more seamlessly. And so we ended up developing this strategy around, of all things, these icons that are actually designed for elementary school students. Has anybody seen these? Yeah. So these may look familiar to some of you. These are the icons that form the basis of a lot of GATE education in California. But they've been more broadly used in a lot of school districts for all students. And they're called icons for depth and complexity. And our argument was that if we could implement a widespread use of these, not just in elementary school, but in middle school, high school, community college, and CSUSB, then students would have a common vocabulary for common kinds of intellectual moves that they are making as they move from one step to the next. Does that make sense? And we piloted it in some classrooms, but really to make this work, we needed to have full buy-in from the entire school district out in Coachella Valley. And that's not something we could get. So to this day, it remains just a theory that it could work. Right? Still a slow hunch. But what it got me to realize was that it wasn't just about helping students make those transitions. It was that we needed to find strategies to help faculty make connections across educational experiences. This shifts the focus. This is now no longer asking students to be more aware of the commonalities that they see from high school into college and to draw on that. Instead, what we're getting at here is this idea that faculty need to be much more aware of what their colleagues are doing so they can point things out to students, right? So if we, for example, were going to use those icons, it's not enough just to use them. But we've also got to remind students that they were being used elsewhere, right? And we have to turn this into a professional development opportunity for faculty. Because teachers need to continue to learn. And as I was working on these projects, I got asked to lead a national project. And it was called Tuning. And it came from Europe. That's why it says Tuning Educational Structures in Europe. And we founded Tuning USA. And Tuning USA was a program that was really designed to, again, try to smooth transitions from 2-year, 4-year, and master's degree institutions. You guys okay back there? You all right? Okay, good. Just want to make sure. And basically, it approached it this way. It asked a question. What do students know? What do students understand? And what can students do at the end of 2 years, or at the end of community college, at the end of 4 years, or their baccalaureate degree, and at the end of a master's degree? And can we align those, right? Can we define outcomes that answer those questions so that we know exactly what students know, understand, and can do as a result of their education? And can we help students be aware of what they know, understand, and can do so that they can carry that learning forward in meaningful ways? Because the thing that we know is that the hardest thing for students to do, and research tells us this, is to transfer learning from one space to another space. And so if you've got a whole bunch of students learning a whole bunch of stuff in a community college, and then coming over to a 4-year institution, moving that knowledge with them in active ways is really hard. On a smaller scale, one of the things that's really hard is taking learning from, say, critical thinking. Moving what you learned in critical thinking and using it in Introduction to Philosophy. That's the hardest thing for students to do, right? Transference of knowledge from one space to another. Okay, and so the idea was we could smooth this by making learning clear to students, helping faculty to understand how students learned over time, and to be very clear about our expectations. And so I worked in all of these different states. Kentucky's labeled. It's the only image of Kentucky I could find.
Where's California?
Didn't work in California. Yeah.
Oh.
We didn't do a project in California. Now, Illinois, Indiana, Utah, Missouri, Montana, and Texas are the states I work in. And it basically looked like this. I would gather faculty from all over these states, in particular disciplines. So we would get historians from all over Utah together to sit in a room and write out what they thought a student should know, understand, and be able to do at the end of 2 years of history study, at the end of 4 years of history study, at the end of a master's degree. And then the idea was they would go back to their institutions, whether it was a community college, a 4-year institution, comprehensive, PhD granting, whatever. And they would look at what they were doing in their curriculum to try to determine where in their curriculum students were getting that learning. And then they would help students to identify that learning more explicitly than they already were. Right? And so we worked on a state-by-state basis for a time. And then I was asked to lead 2 projects nationally. One with the American Historical Association, one with the National Communication Association. And we did the same thing, but for the entire country. And so now, we took historians from all 50 states, and we worked with them to try to figure out the same thing. What do students in history know, understand, and do at the end of 2, 4, and 6 years? Same thing in communication, right? And then they go back to their own states, to their own institutions, and they try to make adjustments to their curriculum, to the ways they teach, in an effort to help students find greater success, to improve learning. But here's the problem I had. This was the goal, right? The goal was to get everybody sort of moving in the same direction, to be rowing in harmony. But that's not what I was finding. What I was finding as I was working on a national level was that there were all these different things going on, right? So we'd get this dude who is on, I don't know what the hell that is. It's damn cool, but I don't know what it is. But he's just off doing his own kind of thing. And then that's not even to speak of this guy. Nobody knows what he's doing, but he's having a good time doing it. And this was actually really discouraging to me, right? Because we're shooting for what's going on up top, but meanwhile, everybody's doing their own thing. The problem was this: there were way too many different efforts to clean up, to fix, to strengthen higher education. And they were getting in each other's way. Too many initiatives that were trying to achieve the same end, but from different strategies. And sometimes they'd be happening on the same campus, and faculty would just be like pulling their hair out because they didn't know which one they should be following, and the two didn't necessarily work together. So I quit. I was on my way out. I was done with this national level work because it didn't seem like it was a problem that could be fixed until I was forced to. So Tuning USA was funded by an organization called Lumina Foundation. Lumina Foundation gives millions and millions of dollars a year to higher education causes. Okay? And they hooked me up with this lovely lady, a woman named Natasha Jankowski, who directs the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. And she was working on something called the Degree Qualifications Profile, which was a Lumina Foundation funded project. And I, meanwhile, was working on tuning. And they said, we know that tuning and the DQP must go together. That was their own slow hunch. They said, you two have to figure out how they go together. And so I got sucked back into all of this work. And the more Natasha and I were working together, the more we came to see that, and this was the slow hunch growing a bit, that these two tools or processes could be used to strengthen higher education. But we had to set out a clear strategy for doing it, for demonstrating how it happened. And that was not the easiest of things to do. Because we were looking at higher education, we found that this is what you individually, were confronting as you stepped into college. Right? There were all kinds of courses, there were assignments in those courses, but sometimes you didn't exactly know how the assignment aligned to what the course was trying to get you to learn. Right? Meanwhile, you've got disciplinary programs, your major, and there's general education, but how those two go together, God only knows. Meanwhile, you've got a job, or you aspire to have a job as a result of college, and then there's all these co-curricular activities you can get involved in. Now, just to add another layer of it, we've got students that start at one institution and transfer to another institution. It's an insanely complicated space to be trying to learn, right? Anybody agree that this is not the easiest space to navigate? And that doesn't even begin to get at the fact that you've got to deal with records, financial aid, advising, right? There's all these different offices that we're going to shuttle you through so that you can deal with all of this mess, right? But we were convinced that if we really start to look at the system, we could begin to find better ways to do things. And a book came out of it. Now, to write this book, we had to look at over 800 different institutions. And we looked at 800 institutions that used either the Degree Qualifications Profile or tuning. And we tried to understand what kind of benefit those two tools had on the way they were organized for student learning. And what we found was that there were 4 different ways or components to productive work that emerged on those campuses that we didn't see on campuses that weren't working with those kinds of projects, right? Number 1, the work was consensus-based, which means that, for example, everybody in the English department agrees what good writing looks like. There's no more of this, well, I just need to figure out what he wants and I can get a good grade. I just need to know what she's looking for and I can get a good grade in her class. The assumption there is we're looking for different things. No, we have to have clear expectations and we have to be on the same page. More broadly, it can look like this. General education, there's outcomes, Did you know that there's learning outcomes for general education? Yeah, I know some of the sophomores in particular know this because we looked at them closely last year. Some of the first years won't know this, but there are statements of what you are being expected to learn through general education. But there's cross-cutting skills, right? Like effective communication. Anybody pledging a sorority? Fraternity? A couple people, not many. Okay. Not joiners, I guess, unless it's the honors program. Well, I'm glad you joined us. Anybody involved in a campus club organization? A few more people. Most student activities like that have some component of communication going on. So could we map the general education learning outcomes to the co- and extracurricular activities that are going on campus? So that what we're getting there is a synergy. So that what students are learning in one place is being reinforced in another. And can we be intentional about helping students get that reinforcement to strengthen their learning? That's what consensus is all about. It needs to be aligned, okay? That means that the assignments you're doing in your classes need to be aligned clearly to the learning you're being asked to achieve in those classes. So no more, how does this assignment fit in with anything we're doing? It needs to be a direct connection. Even better than that, all the courses that you take in a sequence, the natural sciences are already pretty good at this. Other disciplines, not so good. All the courses should be aligned so that over time you approach gradually more complex material, right? So it's scaffolded from basic learning to something that's more complex, right? It needs to be learner-centered. We need to be aware of who our students are. We need to, as this institution, we need to know who you are and what you're dealing with on a daily basis in order to better serve you. An example of this, when we were doing our research for the book, we went to a campus and we weren't there to talk about a problem they were having with student tardiness. We were there to research what they were doing in terms of these two tools. But we kept hearing about how students were always late to class, and it just started all of a sudden. Right? Midway through a semester, all the students started showing up 10 minutes late for class. Faculty couldn't believe it. They were so offended. They couldn't teach students that weren't invested in their own education. How can students not show up on time to class? Well, we started asking some students what was going on. Just out of curiosity, the city bus schedule had changed. And the vast majority of their students got to campus on the city bus. That's an example of not being learner-centered, of not being aware of who your students are, how they get to campus, and what's going on in their lives. Right? So we need to be much more aware of what's happening with our students. And then we need to communicate clearly what the learning is, how we've designed our system for students to gain that learning, and what they can do with it. Even better, we should be communicating that all to employers. Right? We ought to be able to go to employers and say, this is what a degree from this institution means. Right? The student that got an economics degree from Cal State San Bernardino, this is what that person can do. Right? And we should have conversations with employers about that to facilitate entry from, or into the workforce from higher ed. So that's what we began to discover. And what we found is that the 800 institutions that were using these tools, they were beginning to see changes in practice that were improving student learning and success. Okay? And that's what the book tries to demonstrate. So, the conclusion we had after this slow hunch, and for us, we were working on this for 4 years, right? Far cry from my 18 years of Babel, but for 4 years. Higher education is a complex ecosystem that can be organized collaboratively by stakeholders to create synergies that strengthen student success. It's the fundamental argument of the book. Whether we can actually make major change in higher education remains to be seen. 800 institutions are doing it. We'd like to think that other institutions are picking up on these strategies. We've been invited to campuses all over the country to talk about this stuff, to help other campuses begin implementing them. God willing, it happens. My running partner's actually up at San Jose State today, doing all that. Okay. So that's the end of the second story, the much more rapidly ascending one. So let me give you an epilogue. Because here's the other argument I want to make about slow hunches, is that once you've arrived at a conclusion, it only opens up the door for a new slow hunch, right? Especially if the slow hunch is a hunch that's driven by questions, like I was saying before. If the hunch is driven by questions, you're going to find another slow hunch that gradually gestates, germinates, grows over time. So, coming out of the research I did with Natasha, my argument is that what works on a large systemic scale can work on a much smaller scale, the honors program. All right? So that a lot of the changes that are being made in the honors program, a lot of the changes that have been made over the last 4 years since I took over this job, are being motivated by that research. Right? For example, we're going to have a new curriculum when we convert to semesters. And it's a curriculum that is going to be geared towards scaffolded learning, right? Aligned learning for students. That's not something we really have right now. How connected would you say critical thinking and introduction to philosophy are? Do they like very clearly build on one another?
More or less.
More or less?
Because
Okay, let me summarize the answers I'm hearing. I'm hearing a few yes. I'm seeing some heads being shaken no. I'm hearing more or less, which is, well, if you think about it, yeah, they are. And then I'm hearing they should be. It should be a resounding yes. It should be absolutely. Right? And this is not a criticism against our faculty. The honors program curriculum wasn't designed to be articulated in this way. The curriculum wasn't designed for one class to directly feed into another in ways that are obvious and transparent. Right? And we're going to try to do some experiments, and that's what they are, experiments in semesters to see how we can do things differently. And you're going to have to freshmen, you're going to have to let us know how the junior stuff works. And in 2 years, we're going to have to talk to our freshmen about how well the freshman year stuff works. And if it doesn't work well, we're going to change. We're going to tweak. We're going to make adjustments. Okay? Here's another thing that's going to happen, though. In semesters, colloquium's going to go away. I know. I hear a lot of alarmed, disappointed voices. I was going to bring tissues, but didn't have enough boxes to spread across the entire lecture hall. But colloquium's going to go away, and we're going to replace it with optional workshops that you can go to that hit the kinds of things that we're doing. So we'll run a book group for anybody that wants to sort of dive into a book and take a book apart over a year. We're going to run career workshops that help students to think about the kinds of career thinking that they can be doing even as first-year students. Right? We're going to run workshops on research and how you develop a research agenda. We're going to run workshops and that kind of thing on how you go out and find internships and summer research experiences. Right? We're going to do all of this as co-curricular activities. Right? You don't want to come, you don't have to. But then we're going to try to make it clear how what we're doing in those is connected to what we're asking you to do in the curriculum of the honors program. Because we want you to see how the learning you're doing in one place connects to the learning you're doing in another. Because research demonstrates if you can do that, students learn better and they learn more. So a lot of what you're going to see happen in the honors program is motivated by this research. The other part of the epilogue has to do with Beowulf. What's going on with Beowulf?
Yes.
Beowulf continues to gestate up here. But I have some thinking. Right? And here it is. I hinted some of this earlier, but Beowulf is a story that is really challenging us to try to think about the way that encounters with difference in particular, but also recognition that there is difference within communities, threatens the existence of the community, or it's perceived as threatening the existence of the community, that we have anxieties about that. And yet it's also helping us cope with issues of anxiety around violence in particular. In Beowulf, there's this moment when, well, let me tell you part of the story. Has anybody seen the Beowulf movie? The cartoon one? Right, so there's this, okay, a couple people. So Grendel, the monster, dies because Beowulf rips off his arm, and Grendel goes running out and he basically bleeds to death. And at a later date, Beowulf finds Grendel's corpse and chops its head off. And it's so big and heavy that it takes several men to carry it. But they carry Grendel's head back into the mead hall that Grendel had been attacking. Right? It's kind of an interesting move, because they're kind of inviting the violence right back into their mead hall. They had banished the violence away, but they've just invited the violence right back in. Right? And so consider violence in our own society. Gun violence is a major issue. School shootings happen once or twice a year. That doesn't include other mass shootings. It doesn't include individual shootings. Gun violence is a huge issue in this country. No country has gun violence issues like the United States. Right? And yet, we glamorize a movie like John Wick. Which, and I'll be frank, I freaking love that movie. It's a great movie. But we valorize guns, and we sort of adore the visuals of gun violence in our movies. Right? We invite the violence right back in. Okay? And so I would argue that Beowulf, and part of why we keep looking at violence and the return of violence, is because we're a society that is still grappling with issues of violence. Right? So my 18-year slow hunch has gotten me to that point, and that's sort of summarized in a nutshell. But I keep pressing on. And as soon as Natasha and I finish working on what we're working on with higher ed reform, I'm hopefully going to dive back into the Beowulf stuff and write a book on it. So, that is my... So, that is my spiel about the slow hunch. The things I want you to take away from it are this. Number one, slow hunches are driven by questions, right? By this kind of fascination that keeps you asking questions, right? So it's not just that you sort of have this vague notion and over time it solidifies into something clear. It's a vague notion and you refine it and make it something clear because you're asking questions. You keep asking questions about it. You've got to be curious. The slow hunch develops because you're curious, all right? So I want to challenge you to ask questions, to be curious about everything. And in the honors program, you've got to find something to be curious about because you do a senior research project, right? And if you don't have something you're curious about, that's going to be a much more difficult and painful process for you. Okay. With that being said, have a great weekend. I will see you next week.
Stop recording.